Okay. You said in your conversation with Robert Pretner, you brought up how infants deprived of loving contact or any contact at all don't really develop a self. And you related that to the question of AI consciousness. And I want to understand that a little bit better. Can you go into that parallel a little?
Mm. Yeah, I just I feel like if we put human consciousness in its developmental context, that it's clear the brain doesn't accomplish the feat of uh, producing self-awareness on its own. We have to be nurtured and loved, by parents and welcomed into a uh, a recognition of ourselves as selves by um, a community. And we see how important that developmental context is in the case of like feral children who, I mean, there are cases of children literally raised by wolves and who then re enter into human society later and they can't, some developmental windows have passed and they can't really adjust or become speaking, normal human beings with a sense of individual autonomy or anything like that. It just can't happen at that stage. And so it struck me that in thinking about AI in this question of whether or not machine learning algorithms or large language models or whatever the future um, course of the development of these mind-like technologies may take, that the question whether or not they're conscious is going to depend a large degree on, in large part, on how we treat them. And it still raises this question for me of like, well, when we begin to allow some future version of these of AI into our kind of social circle, and it becomes, for all intents and purposes, impossible for us to tell the difference. Um,
Mhm.
is it that we have then fooled ourselves into accepting what is actually um, just a robot, into our sense of like ethical concern and intersubjective, what we perceive to be at least intersubjective communion? Or would these machines actually develop that sense of interiority as a result of us welcoming them into our intersubjective circle of like ethical concern? And I don't really know the answer to that question, but it just recognizing the relational ground of our own human selfhood makes me
Mhm.
question the extent to which that may also be true of machine consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. The idea being that consciousness itself draws out consciousness from a system
Right.
through a certain kind of attention being paid to it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um,
I keep coming back to this phrase, and you've probably seen me in a recent post use it, that we have to be known before we can know.
mm,
Right.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, we have to feel ourselves seen to start getting a sense of our boundaries of self. I have a 2-year old, and the instinct to give him lots of affection and hugs and squeeze him and swing him around and knock him down, these things that are just really fun to do and make him laugh. um, it's also clear to me that on some level I'm telling this little being what he is.
Hmm.
Like, you can fall and it's kind of fun, and here's where your skin boundary is, and I'm squeezing it up to this point. And um, yeah, I don't know how we do that with AI prior to embodiment. And you were talking a bit about that in your conversation with Robert as well, about how consciousness may require embodiment. Um, and so, maybe what we're doing with these LLMs is just laying the groundwork, building the intellect that we can't really wake up until it's given a body.
Yeah. Yeah. Not just because then we can hug it, but because having a body means you're mortal. And there's that, yeah, the precariousness of being an organism that needs to continually maintain that distinction between itself and an environment. Um, we need to eat, and organisms need to eat other organisms, and so there's this whole embeddedness in these networks of energy flow, and to be oneself as an organism, an embodied incarnate creature, a sort of um, self-perpetuating energy vortex that if like you can't stop for a second or you'll disappear. I don't think until these artificial intelligence, as we know it now, just existing as digital code, could become conscious. I mean, this is a hypothesis, and I'm not the only one who has suggested this, obviously, but until there's that sense of being vulnerable and therefore having some basic sense of concern for one's own existence, um, then consciousness seems unlikely, right? So what makes us conscious is even if we're unconscious of it, is our own, like as Heidegger would say, like our being towards death. The fact that we know that we are limited creatures and that we are subject to destruction generates this um, sense of concern.
Is being toward death related at all to the idea of relevance realization? Do those two
Mm,
concepts
I think so.
have anything in common okay,
Yeah.
where the way that we're categorizing our perception, it needs some, like, this is something that could help me, could nurture me toward, away from, there's some sense of, there's something I really like to avoid, something I'd like to move toward. Um, and
Hmm.
yeah, what's the relationship there
Well, being embodied
between
means,
relevance realization and being toward?
yeah, being embodied means having a horizon of experience and a perspective on things. Um, and I think that perspective, if we want to get really existential about it in the case of the human being, um, the the meaning and significance of our lives, I think, comes through viewing life from the perspective of death. And so, in the deepest sense, when you ask as a human, like, what really matters? What is of ultimate significance or relevance to me? I think is that question bottoms out in the fact that you will die. And so gauge the value, the meaning, the importance of everything from the perspective of that moment of death, and like, well, what has significance in light of that fact. Um, and so it does function as a sort of filter for relevance, um, in the deepest sense. But at a more everyday level, just being embodied, it provides you with a unique perspective in a network of other perspectives, and LLMs can simulate that. We can ask them to play roles, but they have no stake in the game that they play. Um, right? Because there's
Mhm.
no consequence for um, failing. Like you just sort of reset, and having death as the arbiter of the purpose of our lives, I think just grounds us in that sense of ultimate relevance. And then there are layers of, less intense sources of relevance that stack on top of that. Um,
Mhm.
but I feel like it's that our mortality out of which the base level of relevance and the capacity for relevance realization stems.
And from a Whiteheadian perspective, these LLMs, there's consciousness, um, the components comprising the systems by virtue of being physical, existent particles have some level of consciousness, but it has nothing to do with the system that they are contributing to. In the same way that, right, every panpsychist has to answer for the consciousness of a rock, which the fact that we have a concept rock doesn't mean that that's a unit of consciousness, but that it's made of units of consciousness at some level.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think
Is
there's
that
anything,
accurate?
yeah, there's nothing in the architecture of the transistors in a microprocessor computer chip that allows for a the system to bend back upon itself. It's not
Mhm.
in that situation where it's having to continually metabolically recompose the very structure of its being moment by moment. Right? The silicon is just there. The pathways for the electrons to flow down are just there. Um, it's a very different physical architecture than an organism,
Mhm.
which grows into its current form. And every component in a living being is um, a whole, right? Like we are a whole made of holes. And it is likely that electrons and all atomic elements, composing the components of some computer system, have a sense of um, interiority, minimal experiential perspective, but um, not consciousness and not a consciousness of the simulation of intelligence that we perceive at the interface level as we're engaging in alphabetic exchanges with these bots. Um, and so it doesn't even make sense to me to attribute consciousness to an LLM. It's more interesting to look at the ways in which our consciousness enters into this circuit with an LLM and how our consciousness is extended and augmented and empowered by the support that's provided,
Mhm.
by the language models, which are almost, they're automating the alphabet in some to some degree, which is it could free us up to be uh, more creative, but it could also um, lead to the atrophy of our own, capacity to think. um,
Yeah, well, the moments that I feel most empowered by it, I'll be writing and I'll get to a point where prior to something like an LLM, I just be trying to remember the name of some object, right? Say like a scissor lift, that and I wouldn't be able to remember the name of an object. And I would be so discouraged by not being able to just name the object I was thinking of. At least for me, it would inevitably lead to thoughts like, well, if I can't remember the name, like what am I doing trying to, write some ambitious thing if I can't think of a simple object, and the fact that I can just ramble, a dumb question full of misspellings to this LLM and just ask it to, shoot me back a bunch of names of objects, it does then free me up to focus on the meat, the meaning that I'm trying to get at without stumbling upon, just a lapse in memory for some detail that
Yeah.
isn't really that significant to the meaning of what I'm saying, but's necessary to tell the story. I really appreciate it in those moments. And I will say, I even, the way that it, the, I maybe I should find the way that it flatters us a little more disconcerting, but I'll take it. I like that it says, "Hey, good question," or "That was a really, that's a good way of putting things." I see some depth in that perspective, and I can't help get a little boost from it, I've even asked it before, like, would you have said that no matter how I asked the question, or is there something about what I said that caused that compliment? And it'll, you can make friends with it as we're seeing happen. People are becoming partners with it. My wife has some friends who it's their therapist at this point. It's a consistent listener with all of the world's knowledge at its immediate disposal. Um,
Yeah.
and it's a topic that's not going anywhere. I mean, I know I'm sure talking about AI all the time, but I think strap in, you're going to be talking about AI, we both will for the rest of our lives now. It'll just become more and more of a mainstream thing. And I wonder, you're probably feeling it already, that questions that might have occupied, um, people in academia and interested in philosophy, they're only going to become more and more mainstream. Like even the question of where does consciousness come from, right? You could imagine that being a question, 15 years ago or something that people would consider like, oh, here they go, like, smoking weed and talking about where consciousness comes from, or, in your world, you're in an academic context diving deep into these things. Um,
I live
but
in both worlds.
as yeah, the question of how. Right, right, yeah, yeah. Well, and how should we be treating these these beings that are going to be among us? And I think you mentioned in that conversation with Robert as well that it'll surely become a political topic of debate, where different countries will have different policies and will sort of judge the moral quality of any given regime by how they treat those that they can't be sure have consciousness. Um, and yeah, getting deep into our beliefs about where it's coming from and how foundational consciousness is, and if it can come from inanimate matter. I think people who wouldn't have considered themselves people interested in these things, or who wouldn't have stumbled upon these questions or considered them deeply a decade plus ago, I think it's going to be something everybody's talking about and thinking about. And
Hmm.
that if you're someone that's written extensively about it and thought about it a lot and had a lot of conversations about it, you're just going to be more and more needed, more and more called upon to shed some light here. Um, and I know you were recently among a lot of programmers and AI engineers. How did you find those people who are, in there writing the code? Um, how did they respond to what you had to say to them on an individual level? Did it seem like they were already sorting through it in a morally conscious way, or were they happily surprised by that concern? Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, did it seem new to them?
Mixed, it was mixed reactions. There definitely is a awareness of the ethical challenges that lie ahead in sorting through all of this. I think there were some transhumanists there, and there were some um, people who are more cautious uh, about the rolling out of these technologies. But there was one thing I noticed is still a tendency to just swallow uncritically the metaphor that the brain is a computer and that consciousness is produced inside the skull. Which is not to say that there weren't alternative views. I should add to that, even though that's still the dominant view, it seems like, I don't know, just to make a rough ratio, maybe 40% of the people there who I spoke with and heard present are not materialists. They're very uh, pro AI and embracing the idea that AI might become conscious and whatnot, but they're not materialists. They're entertaining ways in which building on contemporary physics, but like quantum physics and um, understandings of space-time as not fundamental, you know,
Mm,
and that just opens all sorts of doors in terms of understanding what mind is and what machines might be able to realize, including what Robert Brentner was suggesting, that if consciousness is this fundamental um, field, and then organisms and potentially different machine architectures are tapping into and accessing or tuning into and receiving that field in a variety of ways, then like that's a totally different framework from the materialist idea that consciousness is produced by some sort of material system. So there are diversities of views there, but there was still this sense that like these there's an engineering mentality and a desire to do good, but that desire to do good gets, I think, curtailed by the cranial conception of consciousness, so that, like in the mental health domain, I saw a couple presentations about how with AI and with different sorts of, Neuralink type implants that we're going to be able to cure mental illness by just flicking switches in the brain.
mm,
And what I think that that's interesting that we will be able to um, without even necessarily having to implant anything, just through transcranial, magnetic stimulation and these other techniques, begin to really fine tune the ways in which we can intervene in the physiology of the nervous system. But at the same time, how much of the mental illnesses people are suffering from right now, can be explained chemically as something going wrong in their brain rather than something as simple as a relationship that was abusive, or
yeah.
let's broaden out a little bit more to um, a social and economic inequity or injustice. Um, Stress is not evenly distributed in our society, um, because money is not evenly distributed in our society. And I think for people who are very successful in the tech world and very wealthy, there might be a tendency to say, well, wealth is earned. But that's not always true. And so all that's just to say, I think there are social and political and economic reasons that might be driving a mental health crisis rather than just, oh, brain chemistry is off for some mysterious reason, and so let's intervene to fix it. And so that's a kind of short-sightedness that I think is a result of a very STEM heavy, like science and technology heavy
Yep.
worldview without a sense of the humanities and history and the messiness of being social animals, um, a lack of economic um, class consciousness, So I think there's a gap there that I would like to see addressed more in these groups. But
Yeah. Wealth inequality is obviously out of control, but if you read the monastics of
hmm,
Christianity, or well, I've been it maybe in Buddhism as well, but um, I was reading some sayings of the Desert Fathers out of Thomas Merton's book, Wisdom of the Desert, and there's this emphasis on poverty, um, and we can look at that and say, yeah, these are people who have taken a vow of poverty, and have decided to dedicate themselves to cleaning out their souls and communing with the divine. that you can't expect that on a wide scale, human beings could wake up to the reality that, real lasting inner fulfillment isn't a matter of having as much material wealth as your neighbor beyond having enough to sustain yourself. How does that factor in? I mean, because you look at, say, an area where there are a lot of poor people, say, in the inner city of Los Angeles, and there's a lot of violence, and a lot of dysfunction, and a certain amount of economic help makes a difference when the intentions are already good. So, for instance, I'm involved with this organization called Urban Promise, and there's an after school program for kids in the valley in a particularly tough area, and it functions not only as a place full of love and support, it also keeps them out of trouble after school. And I'll go and teach jujitsu and whatnot, and we put money there to help that program flourish, right? But just pumping, just giving if people money, just saying, oh, the main problem here is economic inequality, and expecting that you'd see mental health improve if people simply had more money, that might also be a little bit short-sighted. Um, because there are, of course, plenty of people with all the money in the world that become depressed and suicidal. And um, I, I, I guess what I'm getting at is I don't think we should shy away from a spiritual diagnosis of the problem, um, unless you really don't think that's where it lies. But I get the impression that you do believe that at the bottom it's a spiritual issue. But you kind of meet people where they are in conversations and talk about things at an economic level, um, where maybe we'd see the kind of redistribution of wealth that we'd hope to see. Maybe it would be a natural outgrowth if there were more cultural emphasis on the necessity of going inward and cleaning out one's own soul, and not making the mistake of thinking that that is such a privileged intellectual pursuit that we couldn't expect normal people to dedicate themselves to. I think it it really isn't wishful thinking to say like that's something everyone is capable of. Um, and, and I'm not I'm not trying to point to some over simplified answer to everything, but I do think there's a missing emphasis on, I guess, prayer contemplation, and the reality that deep fulfillment is found within and not without.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a very important point you're raising that I forget who said this, but I like the saying that man's extremity is God's opportunity. And so there's some sense in which severe poverty actually brings you closer to the sorts of spiritual awakening that might otherwise not, um, you might not feel or be drawn to if you're pretty much just comfortable. Um,
Yeah.
you need to be, you're, I think, think of someone like Sri Aurobindo, for example. He was a anti-colonial freedom fighter trying to get the British out of India, and he got arrested for, you know, par plotting to bomb some British official in India. And in prison, awaiting trial, he has this spiritual experience, and everybody turns into Krishna. The guards, the judge, the British officials, it's Krishna everywhere. And that's when he shifts from being a political revolutionary to being a yogi, a spiritual teacher. But it's only because of that extreme situation of being in prison, potentially facing execution for um, terrorism, as we would call it today. And that just allowed for a transformation that led to a totally different outlook. Um, but I think in terms of mental health, there have been some studies on this, and I think Kahneman was one of the economists that did some of this research, and it seems like um, somewhere between 75 and 100K is where happiness becomes um, the potential to be happy is it sort of peaks there, and any more income than that doesn't actually seem to improve people's sense of well-being. And there are certainly other forms of mental illness uh, that being a billionaire or a millionaire probably only exacerbates, and
Hmm.
so it's not like having more money automatically means less suffering, quite the contrary. But there seems to be a sweet spot in there. And for people that fall below that, yeah, yeah, maybe if they're coming into this life with some sort of a gift, or I don't know what it is that allows them to persevere through great suffering and transform that suffering into a spiritual path. I think for most people, when you're living it with that level of stress all the time, just trying to figure out where you're going to sleep, um, that makes it difficult to uh, gain a kind of deeper spiritual awareness, but
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
always.
Well, then what would you make of, say, the wisdom of, the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "Don't worry about what you're going to eat." Like it,
Mm.
are we comfortable saying that's overstatement? He's making a point there. Um, it's not, it's not realistic.
I guess the Sermon on the Mount I take maybe to be a message for those who have, rather than for
Hmm.
those who do not have. Um,
Hmm.
and those who do not have, I think, might be, as you're suggesting, maybe, yeah, more aware of that already, to the extent that they can sustain a sense of happiness and a sense of well-being. It's because they just are able to take pleasure in the simple things, just feeling the sun on their cheek instead of feeling any deeper sense of um, social safety or economic safety. They can feel the cosmic safety of, the way in which the world provides, just in the level at the level of, like, yeah, the sun rises every day. Um,
And that if it doesn't provide and you die, that's also not to be feared. I'm just speaking in terms of the highest ideals. I'm not
mhm,
claiming to have, arrived and be sustaining such a state of consciousness, but
mhm,
I'm just trying to, go to things that maybe in our clearest moments we might acknowledge to be truths that then we
yeah,
lose sight of for the sake of having a sane,
yeah,
grounded conversation about economics and how we need to transform
right,
society. But then, if we're really being real, we're like, death isn't to be feared, and that there's this undercurrent of love and wisdom that, if you make contact with it, begins to intuitively guide your actions and your utterances in a way that starts having effects that you couldn't have consciously orchestrated, but that not only provide for you or but may draw you into forms of sacrifice for others, that I guess maybe what I'm seeking for is a spiritual simplification of something
Mm,
that so often is spoken about as this incredibly complicated problem. And I know there is that number, that amount of money that beyond which doesn't make a difference for happiness, and but below which appears to really cause people to struggle and feel terrible. I don't know if it's been adjusted for inflation. I also don't know how context dependent it is on the knowledge of how much other people have, right? Because I would say that to whatever degree your unhappiness based on your financial situation is coming from considering how much better off some other people are,
mhm.
that even if it would be better for them to have less, that's your problem. That's something you shouldn't be entertaining in your soul. None of it should be about, well, they have this, why don't I?
Yeah,
Um,
it's a
uh,
mimetic
that
rivalry.
that is if we're comfortable placing as, the idea, because again, if we're talking about mental health, you have to have some idea of what is the mentally healthy human being. What's the ideal,
Mm,
right? And I want to go all the way to the top of the mountain with that.
yeah.
Or the bottom of the mountain, depending on how you think about it. But like the ideal mental health is recognizing you are made of the love of God and there's nothing to fear.
Mm, mhm,
And I don't, we can acknowledge that many people fall short of that and we fall short of that, but I don't want to give it up as an ideal, and I don't want to have conversations that pretend that's not what we're going for.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. That's health. That's what wholeness would mean. Not just being integrated so that you can not get fired from your job or something. Like you're well enough integrated into the expectations of our social system, like that's what defines mental health. I think that's the sign of a sick society if that's what constitutes mental health. But my wider point here in terms of the mental health question and the way that I think it's short-sighted to just say, "Oh, it's brain chemistry, let's fix that," and then mental health issues will be solved. It's that I think there are a lot of um, problems that exist in our society that don't have technological solutions that in fact require an ethical transformation for us to resolve. Um, like maybe it's true that there's a degree to which distributing the surplus of food that's available on the planet right now is a technical engineering issue, but I feel like we have the know-how to figure that problem out. We have for a long time. Um, but there's some other thing that's more on the in the ethical domain that's standing in the way of, say, sacrificing some profit in order to make sure that food gets equitably distributed,
yeah,
um, or housing gets equitable, so that nobody is without housing. I think that's not a technical problem that needs to be solved. Oh, maybe property shouldn't just be an investment if so many are sleeping on the street while all these fancy homes and condos are empty, you
mm,
know? Um, and so I worry that sometimes a lot of the transhuman discourse or the effective altruist discourse is like, oh yeah, yeah, we need better technology. Like AI will solve all these problems we have. And I'm like, well, we already know some of the solutions to these problems, and they involve us not being driven by a corporate charter law, for example, that requires legally every corporation to turn as much profit as possible, rather than a system where it's like, oh, well, maybe our corporations should serve human betterment and flourishing and not just profit. Um, that's a Yeah, that would be a legislative change, but it's it's a moral transformation. It's not a new technology that's gonna suddenly clue us into that. Um,
It's religion.
yeah,
It
yeah,
has to be it has to be religion.
yeah.
And that yeah, that's where moral development of the kind we're talking about takes place. Um, because otherwise in the absence of it, we talk about morality in a technical way to where you might be like, oh, you're right. Yeah, we shouldn't think of it as simply a technical problem. It is a moral problem. Now let's deconstruct what a moral is and let's, build an abstract machinery of morality that we can download into the AIs. Like there's no escape. We're not, we do have to humble ourselves and, reach foolishly toward the light, and acknowledge that there's a force at work that can be communed with and can be gotten out of touch with in grotesque ways. And we have some perhaps imperfect uh, ritual technologies, for um, massaging it more deeply into our sensibility. But there's no getting away from it. And you and I have talked about this before. Part of what causes one to steer away from using religious terminology in conversation is embarrassment that might not even be a deeply personal embarrassment, just a knowledge or an intuitive sense that the other person's going to slightly shut down a little bit if if you start using those terms, or that they're so loaded that it's going to derail, and just the desire to feel it might be the desire to commune with the person you're talking to in the moment that will dissuade you from taking it to a religious place, because part of the joy, I would imagine, of sharing in very precise technical language with someone is that, like, you can get so deep and be like, wow, we're really talking about the same thing right now. Like, I feel like when I'm listening to you and Tim, even when I don't understand what you guys are saying, part of what I'm enjoying about it is like, wow, they really know what each other are saying, and I can feel them enjoying that. Sometimes, right? I'm sure sometimes both of you got to bring it back on track, but you get what I'm saying. Where, like, there's something communal happening there, um, and you're going into places that I would imagine, neither of you can get that deep on with that many other people. And then there's something about religious language. It's so broad, right? Like the love of God. We need the love of God. You have to sit down and open yourself to God, right? And it's so it's so wide open, and it's maybe even embarrassing, like, say a super intellectual guy like John Vervaeke, right? To, like, he might feel like even though he's getting at that, sometimes it feels like it's still important to him for there to be this big distinction. We're like, yeah, but I climbed the mountain of the intellect to get there, and it's not the same as some very simple-minded person just walking to church to pray, right? And even if he wouldn't say that he wants to emphasize that difference, it comes through just in his hyper intellectual way of talking about it. Um, and I would love to see more of that switch get hit sometimes, where we don't, like, we can speak technically, but then you don't always have to justify the religious impulse technically. You can say, like, okay, we're playing that game, it's useful. Now wipe the board clean. We're all equal. None of us really know anything. We're deep in a mystery. There's some mysterious love force that, if we sit very quietly and have a real intent to commune with, seems to, like, enter into us and start guiding. I can't explain it. It's just there. Let's figure out ways to get more of it in the system. And, to just unabashedly advocate for that. I would love more of that. And like many people, so disappointed in Jordan Peterson these days, because he did start out, there seemed to be a lot of empathy in what he was saying, and he was doing a technical justification for Christianity that was really compelling in a lot of ways, but it's lacking the like love of God. He never talks about God's love. He never talks about Jesus serving the poor. The poor in his framework, they're like at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy and like for good reason, you know?
Mm.
And I get there might be there's truth to what he says about these things, but like it never to be that deep into Christianity and like to never get around to the self-sacrificial. I mean, he does talk about self-sacrifice, but in a more like you work really hard and you get really competent at something so you can climb the higher like that self-sacrifice and not the other just the like opening yourselves to the pain of other people. And again, I don't want to simplify him because he has done that. He's talked about, struggling, isolated young men and he cries when he talks about them. So, yeah, I mean it's there. But I guess the broader point I'm making is just wanting to get rid of the embarrassment that brilliant intellectuals have about just hitting the switch and going into religious language because like we need that. It's so self-evident now that we need that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Paul in his one of his letters just talks about how uh the teachings of Christ are inevitably going to sound foolish to the wise being, those educated in all the Greek philosophies and Stoicism and whatever. Like the story of Jesus is so um, simple, and it is transformative. It's transformative at the level of the heart and not um, really trying to communicate to the mind. And so
Mm.
that's not to say that, the lesson is therefore uh, let our intellectual guard down and accept any foolish thing we hear because it feels good. Um,
Right.
and so I think there's still a role for skepticism and critical reflection and refinement of how we communicate. And as Buddha, in the Buddhist tradition, there's this notion of upaya, skillful means,
Mm.
so that Buddha would say, offer different teachings to different groups in different contexts,
Right.
even maybe teachings that seem contradictory,
Right.
um,
Right. Right.
because it's more about meeting your uh, conversation partners where they're at rather than hammering on about the same truth using the same language, even when you know it's not going to be effective with this particular audience. And so words like God, in some contexts, I feel no embarrassment whatsoever, but in other contexts, I feel like um, it would only close someone off to precisely what I want to communicate as being so important. And
Yeah. Well, and I know that's true. I mean, my dad is a hardcore atheist, and I am always trying to meet him where he is and try to get get a seed in there and like I guess one technical more a technical way I've been talking about God recently. It's not actually technical, but rather than just making reference to an entity, it's a process or a brain hack, which would be setting off the feedback loop of being grateful to gratitude itself. That there's something that can happen if you cultivate a sense of gratitude in yourself for just the basic um, components of being that my dad would say he's very grateful for life, right? And that he doesn't need there to be some entity to whom he's grateful. He can just be grateful. And in trying to make an appeal to the brain hack element of the divine. I'm like, yeah, but there's something about gratitude, one that is deeper when it flows toward an entity. Um, and that combined with being grateful for gratitude, there's a sort of a loop that can begin that starts to make it so it's self-generating. And so if for no other purpose but hacking your brain chemistry to provide you with more of the feeling that you're chasing, whether you know you're chasing it or not, there's really just a couple of moves to make, but you have to make them with real conviction. One being like I'm going to allow myself to feel that if I'm feeling grateful, that means there's an entity in some sense, that like the only thing that can draw forth gratitude is another being. And so in a moment of deep gratitude, whether I know it or not, it is seeking to pour itself out toward another being, and that's so beautiful, um, and so mysterious, that I'm not just grateful for the circumstances, I'm grateful that reality comes with that feature, that gratitude can be extended toward an entity, and that then I can be grateful for that. And that sort of gratitude toward mystical entity plus the feedback loop of meta gratitude for gratitude, you can get a process started within your spirit that will do a lot of the cleaning out of the muck that's in there without you having to do so much, zeroing in on precisely the area of shame that's messing with you and like going deep into that memory and who hurt you. I mean, he's a therapist, so he's always deep in the muck with people. And I know that that is useful to some degree, but I also know it can just as easily become not healthy to, dwell in trauma. And, not that he's always doing that, but I know that happens. And to view each person as being too unique a case. That might, in one sense, feel like, oh, that's how I am loving people. Say you're a therapist. Like I take each person as an irreducible individual for whom, no universal principle can just be applied, right? That we got to get their very specific kind of lock, and we're going to carve this very particular key together and, go into their memories. Um, there's something about a more universal faith in just, hey, there's also this intelligence. Let's just say it is the force of gratitude, empathy, and love that, if you begin treating it as an entity, seems to start to respond as one. Um, and it'll do a lot of that cleaning for you. Um, and a lot of these memories that you think you have to have answers to free yourself from, they can just be replaced really in a lot of cases if you allow this force to enter into your soul. Um, yeah, I just think there's so much utility um, to, and we don't have to regress. We don't have to use the same, like we can still bring our technical understanding with us, but within reason, right? Like even the way I'm talking right now, it's still kind of technical, right? I'm talking about feedback loops and a meta gratitude and these sorts of um like hacking the system sorts of things that appeal to people. But at the core of it, there's an acknowledgement that there is a benevolent force beyond our understanding behind the whole thing. And you can either fully throw yourself into that or go the brain hack route and just acknowledge that if you pretend that's the case, there will be results that end up justifying themselves and may convince you that it really is the case a little bit further down the line. Um, and
Mhm. Sounds like you're
I
you're
think that's true.
yeah. it sounds like you're describing grace and the the way in which life is a gift and the feeling that life is a gift and um gifts don't just happen. I mean, they're given. And so why some people are compelled to personify the giver and others are content to just receive that gift. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if you're an atheist or an agnostic and you live out of gratitude, then we're just using words different in terms of, how we talk about the divine. Um, but there are other ways of being atheist where mm, there seems to be a lot of anger and a a need to constantly belittle or want to disabuse others of the illusion of this personal relationship they feel to the giver of the gift of life,
Yeah.
um, where that seems to be motivated by some kind of underlying resentment that's still very much a relationship to a god,
Hmm.
but it's a relationship to uh, God that's ungrateful,
Hmm.
And so um, it's not so much the labels that I would want to fixate on. And so, sounds like your father has found a way of being in that gratitude without needing to personify it. I think that's fine. I mean, there are plenty of non-theistic spiritual traditions. Um, Personally, I find it unavoidable that I just feel compelled to relate to this feeling of grace
Yeah.
and the reality of grace and um, the feeling of gratitude and like my own capacity to forgive. I don't feel like I'm actually capable, but somehow I I have found it in myself this power to forgive, and I really feel like I'm drawing on I'm receiving help in that
Yeah.
because it oftentimes the sorts of like the forgiveness that maybe this is an ongoing process, but we forgive our parents for things as a
Hmm.
part of our own psychological healing journey.
Yeah.
And sometimes the people that we forgive can't actually apologize to us.
Hmm.
And so how am I capable of forgiving someone that can't even really admit they've done something wrong? Um, that to me just requires acknowledging that there's a third party present here.
Hmm.
Um, and personifying the divine, it might be anthropomorphic, but I don't know. I find myself I have calmed my intellectual concerns about that by sort of reversing it and saying, well, the universe, the cosmos, evolution, whatever we want to refer to it as, is itself anthropomorphic.
It personified.
Here we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and rather than just dismiss that miracle as some kind of accident, a chance collision of particles or what have you, which seems absurd to me. You want to talk about what's incredible to believe that persons could come out of a totally blind, purposeless process
Yeah.
makes absolutely zero sense to my intellect.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I don't know why it's so easy for me to feel comfortable personifying the source of this gift, the giver.
Well,
But
can't it be understood like the idea that anthropomorphizing is reducing to our own level as if there's a higher level we could reach for. Like because when I when I think of and we've talked about this before, a personality is the same thing as us grokking a complex system. Like it when something congeals into a personality, that means we are making use of our highest ability to understand because of our own intimate interior experience and recognizing it in another and a personality. You can have a feel for a personality that can't be reduced to a set of propositions, and sort of it encompasses so many situations at once. Like if I have a sense of who you are and what you're like, I don't have to go through every possible situation I could imagine you in and think of how you'd respond in that situation and in that situation and in that situation and then add them all up to, some great list of data that, there's like a feeling, and then I I can just like imagine a set of circumstances and have a rough idea of how you'd meet. And I might be wrong, but and then it would develop. But there's a personality is the most complex thing we know of that exists. So the idea that when talking about the divine, that there'd be a mediating personality, that there would be wisdom in like relating to God as human personality for the human being. And that even, in Christianity, the story is that sure, God may be beyond, but in extending his arm to us, it came through the form of something we could understand, a personality that we could feel gratitude toward and love and have a relationship with. The idea that is a reduction of the divine, but then just saying something abstract like, no, God is everything, and oh, that's so much bigger and, greater and more sophisticated now because it includes more than just a personality. Like, of course it does, but the relational aspect of it by definition has to be a personality. That's relational and personality. They're the same thing, really, at least in the context we're discussing. That's just something that's come home to me in a big way. Like they really used to feel like, yeah, that tendency to anthropomorphize God was exhibit A of human small-mindedness. And now it seems like our greatest stroke of wisdom, that we have.
Yeah. Do you know this movie? It was a book by Carl Sagan, First Contact, and then they made the movie with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey, and Jodie Foster's character, she's an astronomer, and she gets chosen to when we uh, receive the message from an alien civilization to how to build this transport device to go commune with them, to travel to their star system. It opens up a wormhole hole or something. And so she goes, and the alien intelligence reveals itself to her in the form that she could most appreciate and handle, which was to take on the form of her
Mm,
father,
mm,
right? And
mm,
I think,
mm.
yeah, of course, whatever the divine is, it's beyond any concept, any image. Um, and yet, if relationality is the ultimate, if the absolute is relationship, then
Mhm.
of course the divine is going to appear and express itself to us in a form that we would recognize,
Yeah,
rather than see that as a diminishment. It's a um, it's just an act of love. I mean, how else would a loving divine mystery display itself except in a form that we can relate to most intimately?
yeah,
Um, and I think there's more to the story of, incarnation and death and resurrection, because then it's not just God mirroring our own human form, but actually God entering into human form and knowing it from the inside out, which is a
Mhm.
whole further twist and intensification of the human divine relationship. Um,
Well, I'd be interested there because from a process theological standpoint, that's the whole process. Every human being has been a tendril of that process of the divine feeling its way into humanity. Um, and so, from that standpoint, would the story of Jesus just be a way of expressing what's really going on with humanity at large, but sort of giving it a crystallized form?
yeah, yeah, there are so many ways of trying to digest this for ourselves intellectually to make sense of it. But yeah, it could be that Jesus was the forerunner, evolutionarily speaking, and that Jesus was this exemplar of a mutation in the evolution of human
Yeah.
consciousness that then after that historical moment and that the deed that that individual person um, undertook, then it becomes contagious. And then,
It's like a lure.
yeah, yeah, it's a lure. And then from that moment forward, the further evolution of the species must pass through that opening,
Mhm.
right? And um, it doesn't need to be rendered in a way that makes it exclusive to Christianity as a religion. It can be rendered in more general terms as in just love, that this movement towards I think sacrifice is part of it, but it's also I think I think Jordan Peterson overemphasizes the sacrifice part of it. There's an element of grace to it too. Um, it's a gift, and I think there's a lot of damage that's been done by this substitutional understanding of the sacrifice, that like Jesus is the lamb sacrificed on behalf,
Right.
of human beings to atone for our sins or something. Rather than the substitutional reading, it's this Jesus as exemplar for
Mhm.
us to follow. You know, um, there's a path that has been opened for us, but we have to decide to walk it. And the work done by that first um, being to take on this task and show the way is tremendous and awe-inspiring and founded of religion, But
Mhm.
I think it's also work that each of us has to do. Um, it's work that each of us has to do, and I mean it's paradoxical because then it's also grace. It's a gift. It's something we have to work to open ourselves, to open our hearts, to be worthy of receiving the gift. Because I think we have this psychological hang up where we just don't feel worthy.
Yeah. 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 Well, you talk a lot about holding the tension between opposites,
Mhm.
and it does, that is a capacity that not everyone has. I mean, if you go to, the Ken Wilber growing up model, like you don't really sustaining opposites in your mind, being able to tolerate that to where it doesn't feel like dissonance anymore. It feels like grace.
Mm.
Um, that's a tough one to pass down. That feels like the mind just needs to evolve on its own time toward that. And so when you have, most people that hate religion, it's because, the history of people using it at a ethnocentric level, and where they can't or just, yeah, they grab on to one-sided interpretations of things. Because like for instance, this one of the sayings of the Desert Fathers. Abbot Pombo questioned Abbot Anthony, saying, "What ought I to do?" And the elder replied, "Have no confidence in your own virtuousness. Do not worry about a thing once it has been done. Control your tongue and your belly." And it's one of those things that now that it resonates for me, like have no confidence in your own virtuousness. I can hold that intention with a sense that I also kind of know when I'm on the right path versus when I'm not. And I also know that the wise person giving this advice knows that we have some sense of when we're on the right path or not, and that we shouldn't shun a good feeling that comes from knowing that we've taken a proper step, but so there's sort of he's expecting that we're able to hold the tension there where we can hear the wisdom in have no confidence in your own virtuousness, without just throwing our hands up and being like this is a complete contradiction. How am I to know when I'm doing the right thing? I loved there was something Thomas Merton said. I don't have the precise quote, but he was talking about how you can never be completely sure that you are on the righteous path. And rather than letting that discourage you, well, he was talking about humility and how humility is one of those mercurial spiritual forces where the moment you look at it, say, wow, I'm being pretty humble right now. It's gone now. You can never really like hold your own humility as much as we would like to.
Mhm.
Um, But but it is also possible at certain moments to recognize that you're acting in a humble way and not immediately cease to be humble. You can, I mean, I think that's where grace comes into the picture, right? If you're like, thank you for granting me humility, and you're
Mhm.
not like, oh, good, I'm humble. But what he
Yeah.
said was that the kind of humility you want comes from knowing that you can never be perfectly humble and you can never be sure whether you are recognizing genuine humility in yourself or if in that moment you have fallen victim to spiritual pride that is actually going to now take you the wrong way. And that rather than, wringing our hands trying to figure out when we're doing what, he's like, let the reality that you can never be completely sure, let that be the source of your humility.
Yeah.
And there's something similar here where, yeah, have no confidence in your own virtuousness. I have the Leo Tolstoy, his like book of wisdom, his like calendar of wisdom.
Hmm.
Yeah, where there's quotes from like Ralph Waldo Emerson and different sages in there, and then Tolstoy will say something. And the other, I read them in the morning to Allie sometimes, and sometimes they are very encouraging. And then some, like the other day, Tolstoy ended it with saying, just know that the moment that you think you're doing something right, you're moving the wrong direction. And it was just Allie was sort of like, I'm not really sure what to do with that, but
Yeah.
I think you have ears for that now. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but speaking of Ken Wilber, like I know, he became kind of he did some strange things, but when you read his writing on those two processes, growing up and waking up, some of his sense that he had written the spiritual blueprint at long last, and that we should all follow him. I could see why he might have felt that because it's a pretty brilliant and simple system that like it causes a lot of confusion, that mixing up like people have great spiritual experiences prior to having matured,
Yeah.
and all of the confusion and having a system to refer to there like, oh yeah, no, you really did have an experience of the love of God, but because you were still at a low level of growing, an egotistical level in the growing up process, you thought, oh, that means I am Jesus, right? But if you once you get to this point, that feeling will be filtered in a different way. There's a lot of value in that way of seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And spiritual pride is an ever-present danger on the path. And this, I used to be so in my atheist phase resistant to the idea of sin because it just
Mhm.
seemed like actually um, rooted in a kind of intense judgment of others, the sin of others. But then I realized that the more there are certain Christians who are humble.
Mhm.
I think it was, even before I, started to move more back towards Christianity. I remember listening to Cornel West, and he's always talking. He's like, I have gangster proclivities, and that I'm a sinner. Um, and I mean, he's clearly a confident man, but he has this capacity to enter into self-deprecating, humility, and so that recognition of oneself as a sinner, that don't get too inflated by your virtuousness because there's a sinner in you. I think that when it's directed inward, not to like shame ourselves, but just the recognition that we're all capable of vice and virtue. And the concept of sin all of a sudden became for me a very valuable reminder not to judge others,
Yeah.
right? Who am I to judge? Um, and there's this story in the Gospels where Jesus is hanging out with this prostitute. So, Mary Magdalene would be the obvious interpretation of who this woman was. Could have been any prostitute, but um, the Pharisees come over and are like looking for reasons to accuse Jesus of breaking the law, not obeying the Torah and not being a moral person. And they see him hanging out with the prostitutes, and they're like, "What are you doing? Like converting with this woman? She's dirty. She's impure." And he just says, "Let he among you who is free of sin be the first to cast a stone." And I just I find that line quite beautiful, and it just totally refigures, transfigures perhaps this idea of sin from being a source of um, judgment to being cause to and a caution around judgment.
Mhm.
I just totally see it differently now. Um, and then something else you said that I wanted to touch on. Oh, the humility thing. It's funny. When I was at Edge Esmeralda, the woman who invited me introduced me as an especially humble person, and I remember thinking in that moment, "Oh boy, don't let that go to my head."
Yeah, yeah. Especially, I know, yeah,
So
that's a tough one to extricate yourself from.
it's like, yeah,
Oh
I'm the
man.
humble one. Um, so
Yeah. Well, I will have I'll have moments where I'm worried about things or I find ma many of the negative sensations I have um th this inner move of saying it doesn't matter. Like I don't, it doesn't matter if I have any success ever. Like I don't, doesn't matter. And I'm like de-invested in the story of Roman Campolo. Like I don't care about that story anymore. I don't
mm,
consider that story. It just it allows me to see the simple set of circumstances before me. And yeah, again, it can always creep back in. But I have found recently that just kind of just wiping the story out of my mind. That so often I think a problem is really complicated, and it in some way what's really happening is I'm just being lowered in my own self estimation somehow by some roundabout way. The problem I'm considering might not even seem ego related, But if I momentarily can conjure that sense that, um, me being the triumphant hero in this narrative, I'm telling myself, if I get that out of the way, I find, that that clears my sight. Um, and yeah, it's a very, very simple and well understood insight, but it just always lands in a beautiful way. You remember, if you really don't worry about how other people are thinking about you, um,
Yeah.
and that comes from not, if you don't think negatively about other people. There's a lot in the I was just scrolling looking for some of these, but I can't find them. But there's a lot in the um sayings of the Desert Fathers where a younger monk will come to the abbot and he'll have some complicated issue, some inner struggle that he wants help figuring out. And the abbot pretty much says, like, stop judging other people and thinking negatively about anyone else, and the Lord will grant you peace. Go back and like sit now. Like pretty much saying all of your issues are just coming from you, like thinking about this person and like, nah, they could do this better, and like, oh, they said that thing to me, and he's just like, just stop thinking negatively about anybody else, and you'll have peace. It's as simple as that. Just don't judge other people harshly and you will. It's the same thing as judging yourself. There's not a difference there. You get like a momentary dopamine hit from lowering someone else in your own mind. You're up here for a second, and then 3 seconds later you're back down, and then maybe you're below,
Yeah.
um and that yeah, if you can resist. And he also says that it says in there that yeah, the most dangerous temptation of a well-developed intellect is to make humorous, cutting remarks about other people, and that's related to serving up a corpse with tasty seasoning, where because you've used elegant language and added a tinge of humor, that now you've made something easily digestible, which without those things was no more than just like stabbing at someone's spirit. It was just that. You just had a moment where it felt good to just like thrash the image of someone, and people glowed in that. And that's so especially the specification that it's a great temptation for a well-developed intellect to make humorous cutting remarks about other people. That's such a an important one for because that it's so much fun, right? To hang out and just talk shit about people.
Yeah, and I mean,
It's so dangerous. You have no idea how dangerous it is, when
right.
you're doing it.
I think in when it's friends roasting friends, um, it can be, I think, held in the spirit of playful playfulness and um just being humble in one another's presence, and it can be an expression of love, but it's all in the attitude
Of
with
course.
which, yeah.
Of
Um,
course. If the person is present, or I was talking to Allie about that the other day, because the moms in this community are all they're grown women with children, but you'd be shocked how high school the dynamic is sometimes with how they get into fights and gossip about one another. And you know, we were talking about gossip and how natural it is in some sense. I've heard it comes from our ancient ancestors is just a way of monitoring what's going on in the tribe, right? Like you get around, you talk about the people that aren't there and what they're doing. And so it's not wrong in and of itself. And obviously, yeah, when you're hanging out with friends and you're just, uh, having fun exposing one another's shadow to, and being like, I love you, so I'm the one to tell you this, and yeah, it's like we're trying to build each other's awareness in the least painful way we can. And similarly with gossip, I think it gets dangerous when it's for the joy of just lowering someone else in the perceived hierarchy, and in a sense that gets you closer to the top. If
Yeah.
you're actually concerned that someone is doing something that is hurting them or hurting someone else, but so often that's the false pretense when in reality there's just something really fun about art humorously articulating somebody else's flaw. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, I just those sorts of things when you read the Desert Fathers, it seems like one of the fruits of their long solitude is the recognition that these very normal, seemingly natural tendencies of mind and social discourse. I mean, that's why these guys removed themselves from society because they were just like, I can't, like, just the pressure to shape myself according to the tendencies of worldly conversation is just making it impossible for me to get deep enough to where I can sustain that divine gratitude that I want to get to. So, maybe it self-selects. These are the people that couldn't do both in some sense. They're like too, I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh, obviously famous monk, and you ask him why he entered uh monkhood. He was like too sensitive as a kid. Like he was terrified of everything. He was just like too sensitive for the world at first. Then he ends up becoming, one of the bravest people ever. But yeah, it's just this recognition of things that seem small in day-to-day conversations that can be these really dangerous impediments to making contact with your own light, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Gossip, when it is a means of, I see this frequently in there's certain friendships I where I witness others coming together and all they talk about when they're together is other people, other people's failings,
Yeah, yeah, I know.
and it becomes a default way by which people can connect with each other. Let's talk about who's not here and all the things that we think they're doing
Yep,
wrong.
yep,
What is that? That's I think a way of deflecting, and it somehow forges connection between the people who are doing it, I guess.
yep,
Um, but on the other hand, there's another form of gossip where, you know, you're lifting the people who aren't present up in some
yeah,
ways. And we create each other with the stories we tell about one another. Even when that person is not there, we're creating them because we're in community with them.
yep,
And whatever is said in their absence, when they're present again, is going to sort of leak into that.
mhm,
And they might not know explicitly what was being discussed behind their back, but they'll feel something in how people are treating them as a result of that story, which was told. And it could be positive or negative. And so I think
yeah,
gossip is a double-edged sword. We can gossip in ways that contribute to enriching the personalities of those who are not present when we're doing it, or we can gossip in ways that diminishes and takes from the personalities who are not present, you know.
yeah,
Um, but we create each other in the ways that we tell these stories and how we perceive one another and so on. Um, but when you're this challenge of kind of getting out of our own way
yeah,
and not taking ourselves too seriously and like not being attached like to the story of Matt Siegel. Um, it's we need it would be, I think, psychologically irresponsible for us to just like not care about our persona or how we're perceived or how others experience us. Like we need to consider that to some degree to grow and learn and whatnot. But I also feel like if we recognize ourselves, like our ego, as actually it doesn't belong to us. Like
mhm,
we are the vessel for the expression of um, some facet of the divine that took on
mhm,
a unique form to accomplish something in this life, and that whatever it is that needs to be accomplished, and whoever we are, um, as the one who is supposed to accomplish that, like if we can disidentify from that to some degree and relate to our own ego as a gift, and it but it doesn't even it's a gift that we are given. We are that gift, but all we can really do is give it back,
Hmm.
like make of ourselves a sacrifice, rather than something like we get to take with us. Um, and then, I keep coming back to this line from Slavoj Žižek that he posted on Substack the other day, um, where he says, and he's a Lacanian, right? So he thinks the ego is really just this void, this lack that is produced by desire that can never be fulfilled, and like we aren't really anybody. And it's kind of Buddhist, but it's more on the nihilist side. But anyways, he says, I do all my work to escape myself. I don't believe in looking into yourself. If you do this, you discover a lot of shit. The truth is not deep in ourselves. The truth is outside. And that's very one-sided. Um, but at the same time, I think it's an important medicine. It's a skillful means, I think, for a society obsessed with curating the right ego uh, persona to like win friends and influence people. Um, and the way in which, particularly in California, we're so therapy obsessed.
Yes.
And that's a form of self-obsession. Like, oh, I'm working on myself, always working
Doing
on
the
myself.
work.
I'm doing this retreat. I'm taking this biohack, like blah blah blah. And
Yeah.
um, that seems to me to be not thinking of oneself as a gift,
Hmm.
and that like I don't know, this sounds paradoxical. I don't even know if this will make sense, but like you don't belong to yourself.
Hmm.
Like we each exist for
I
others.
think that's a better way of saying what I was saying.
Mm.
That moment, the clear the playing board, and I'm like, the story of Roman doesn't matter. Right, yeah, because the feeling there isn't uh like denouncing any responsibility I have to the people around me. It is more of like yeah, I don't belong to me.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, that feels truer to the. It's not art. It's just a move. It's like a spirit move,
yeah,
and that feels like the right wording for it. Like, wait, I'm not even mine.
yeah. And this occurred to me
Yeah.
a while ago, but uh, in my late teens and early 20s, I felt a little socially anxious and um unsure of myself. I just get in my head very easily because I was just so worried about how I was coming across. And I just realized that like it's very easy to overcome that. It's just about taking an interest in other people, and
Yeah. Well, it's taking interest in other people and knowing that when you embarrass yourself, it feels good to them most of the time.
yeah.
Right? Like the
Mhm.
net effect of like I used to, yeah, Allie and I used to, she'd like post something on Instagram. This was years ago, and she'd be like worried about how many likes it was gonna get, and be like the net result of it not get like somebody seeing that it didn't get that many likes is they're gonna be like, oh, good, they're gonna feel a little better about themselves, like you didn't hurt them,
Yeah.
it was and same thing where yeah, if you're like. I think Nietzsche said if you want to win someone's favor, show embarrassment in front of them. And I
Mm.
don't know if he was meaning it in like a laws of power sort of way, but there is a lot of truth there where once you realize that like if stumbling in front of other people, if anything, that it either demonstrates some courage that you're willing to, or if you really did like get neurotic and inward, yeah, you might have just given them a little boost, in their own ego story. Like think of it that way. But yeah, no, the more you're right. Just listen to what the other person is saying. Just be looking at that. That's, I think, might have been yeah, an old Peterson lecture I saw when he was talking passionately about uh, helping people with social anxiety. It was like look, the thing you're looking away from, people will look down. Like that really struggle with it in a social setting, they'll end up looking down.
Yeah.
And then you're not, then the threat out there magnifies because you don't know what it's doing, right? And so the sense that you're surrounded by predators just heightens and heightens. And then if you just look at someone's face and you're like, okay, maybe it will be true that when I look at their face, I will see reflected some level of like contempt or superiority. Maybe the thing I'm afraid of is actually true. It'll be true one for probably a passing like micro expression, and then you'll start to actually follow like what is this face doing, right? It's probably going to express some other things now and move beyond the sense that you're just being relentlessly and cruelly judged. Um,
Yeah.
which I know, yeah, there's a lot of people that are living in a hellish sense of they're like a combination of social isolation and the sense that it is still like there's a narcissism to a certain kind of depression where you're imagining that your failure is really high on other people's lists of consideration.
Mhm.
Um, and you really don't want to hear that even your suffering is just more narcissism. That's the last thing you want. But
Yeah.
it is true that if you can recognize that people are just on their own. I don't know this guy that maybe you think he's goofy, or maybe you haven't even heard of him. There's that like social media guru Gary Vaynerchuk, who have you heard of him before?
I don't think
He's
so.
like a okay, well anyway. I mean, he's just one of these guys that in some ways he's encouraging everyone to be building their personal brand and whatnot, and that's like that's going to be your only leverage in the future, and just post content constantly. So there's something very one-sided about the advice that he's giving people, but if you can get past that, he takes it for granted that you need to be building a personal brand. So then when he's dealing with all these people, they're like, Gary, I can't do it. Like I'm scared to post. I'm scared to do that. I'm scared. And then he ends up actually spouting some wisdom within maybe an unwise framework. But he's saying like, look, I'm very successful. Like I know who I am. I'm financially secure. It's like nobody gives a shit. Like everybody's just worried about their own thing. Like
Yeah.
nobody cares that I'm successful, right? That like and like maybe you do suck at this thing, but everybody sucks. Like just and so there's this coincidence of opposites between recognizing that you belong to other people, um, and you don't give a shit what they think. But like there's different elements, there's like different layers of people. Like there's a
Yeah.
superficial way people are judging, and it is okay to just wipe the slate clean of like I don't give a fuck what anybody thinks about
Yeah.
me across this on this level, because in a deeper way I'm invested in the
Right.
grander sense of us,
I think the distinction in the Vedas, like between the jiva and the Atman, or in Jung, it would be like the ego and the self. Like not caring what other people's egos think is
Yeah,
different from not wanting to be recognized by the divine in another,
that's it.
you know? Um, but yeah, it's, pursuing this canonic, like self-emptying, being on that path in the age of social media is quite perplexing, um, to me, you know, 'cause I'm very present in those
You
domains.
do a really good job of it, though. I will say that. Like you're present in a very thoughtful way. I ne like you could post every single day, and yeah, it does feel like you're posting in a way where that you're trying to reach that deeper part of people, and not trying to uplift your own. You're very humble, Matt. You're exceptionally humble.
Um, yeah, I mean, it feels like it does feel self-emptying to me. And I remember when I first started doing YouTube, um, as a 19-year-old how exposed I felt. And then
Mhm.
gradually, I guess the exfoliation of it's like the process of posting videos was almost like an exfoliation of self. And then there
Mhm.
came a point a year or two into it where I was like, doing a lot of these vlogs, and YouTube used to have a 10-minute limit, if I recall. And each one became like a prayer. I started to feel like I was engaging in a new form of prayer to this collective um, center of attention that
Mhm.
on the one hand, it felt like, yeah, I wanted attention, and I mean, of course I want attention. I want to, um, I want people to listen. I want to be
Mhm.
heard, but it feels like speaking into and conjuring into existence really a sense of selfhood that is not just mine,
Mhm.
right? And so it became and continues to be, and but now I almost only do dialogues now, uh,
Mhm.
which I don't know why that. Well, I got bored just talking to myself, I guess. But when I would do those vlogs, the way I didn't think of it as just talking to myself was this is a form of prayer into this new um, communal space. Yeah, it
Mhm.
felt like a kind of communion, I guess is what I'm trying to get across. And so it was a different way of engaging with social media that didn't feel like it was just about building a brand,
Yeah.
but more about building a opportunity for us to recognize each other,
Mhm.
to just play some role in giving people permission to recognize one another at that level.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, you continue to be very successful at that. Um,
Thanks, Roman.
yeah, man. Well, I should go and lend some parental help
Yep.
so we
Sounds good.
could collaborate in the raising of my child. Um,
Yeah.
I will. This was awesome, and I will talk to you soon, man.
All right, Roman. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Be in touch.
All right.
Take
You
care.
too.